Welcome to Art 305, Art and Mass Culture, Chapter 3, The Renaissance, Part 2, Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel ceiling frescoes, and the invention of the printing press. Part 2 will cover the heightened idealization in representations of the human form, Michelangelo's The Sistine Chapel ceiling frescoes. A fresco is a painting on wet plaster. The revolution of printed books, Gutenberg's invention of the printing press, and this represents an advance in communicative technology with the invention of the mass medium of the printing press and movable type. Printed pictures, mass medium technology of the perspective age. Albrecht Dürer, printed images as fine art, and the development of popular art through the mass medium of printing. And we'll look at fine art versus popular art. And we'll finish with the most important impact of printed images. The heightened idealization in representations of the human form. The Apollo Belvedere sculpture was excavated in 1479. It is a celebrated sculpture from classical antiquity. The Apollo is now thought to be an original Roman recreation from about 120 CE. In 1496, young Florentine artist Michelangelo Buonarroti traveled to Rome to draw figures like the Belvedere in order to learn antique proportions and poses. We have already discussed Michelangelo's David as one of the great Renaissance icons that celebrate the ideal human nude. And this is a view of Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel ceiling paintings, frescoes. These were paintings done on wet plaster, and they were painted between 1508 and 1512, and the location is the Vatican in Rome. Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel ceiling paintings. Even though he described himself as a sculptor, Michelangelo's fresco paintings in the Sistine Chapel are as famous as his sculptures. Attached to St. Peter's Cathedral in Rome, the Sistine was the Pope's private chapel built in 1483. Pope Julius II hired Michelangelo to paint the ceiling, which he did between 1508 and 1512. The chapel is the location for papal conclaves and many other important services. Michelangelo chose to depict the creation and fall of man as recorded in the Old Testament, in the book of Genesis, in the Bible. He covered more than 12,000 square feet of ceiling with over 300 figures, most of them larger than life. The Adam in the temptation scene measures over 10 feet tall. The 9 central images are episodes from Genesis that are meant to be read like a storyline or a narrative line or a narrative arc. God separates the light from the dark. God creates the planets and places them in the heavens. God separates the land and the water on earth. God creates Adam. God creates Eve. Adam and Eve eat the forbidden fruit from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil and then are expelled from paradise. Man falls into sin. God sends the floods to destroy all those not saved in Noah's ark, and Noah falls into sin. From the narrative follows the Christian assertion that man is innately sinful, and this is the belief in original sin, and that man needs the redemptive sacrifice of Jesus' death on the cross in order to be saved and eventually rejoin God in heaven. The Sistine Chapel ceiling is painted in fresco. True fresco involves painting on wet plaster, which is fresh or fresco plaster, so that the pigment becomes bonded with the plaster and the painting becomes part of the wall. And you might remember in Leonardo's The Last Supper, he used an experimental technique that did not work well, and that's why that painting is so deteriorated. Michelangelo began the process with preparatory drawings called cartoons, which the Pope had to approve. The drawings were then expanded to full scale and transferred to the plastered ceiling. When the drawings were removed, the artist had a connect the dots sketch outlining his composition, and then he could commence painting on the wet plaster. Michelangelo's creation of Adam. Michelangelo's most famous panel from the Sistine Chapel ceiling depicts the creation of Adam. It is a powerful diagonal composition based on the parallel positions of God and Adam. If we enter the composition of Michelangelo's creation of Adam at the upper left and scan toward the right, our gaze meets the figure of God zooming toward us. The implied lines of the creation support Michelangelo's belief in an active, dynamic power creator. In the creation of Adam, God is depicted as an elderly white man with a powerful, muscular body. It was such an unusual depiction at the time that some commentators failed to recognize it as God. Adam is similarly buff. Their physiques are intentionally exaggerated. Michelangelo believed that a beautiful body was the ideal reflection of a perfect moral character. And of course, he believed that God and his first creation embodied divine perfection. Crossing the active diagonal thrust of the composition is God's outstretched arm, which reaches toward Adam to give him the divine spark of life. The position of their two hands has become such an important icon in Western culture that artists quoted it in the posters for Steven Spielberg's 1982 film, E.T., the Extraterrestrial. And you can see next to it the pose that it's taken from. All right, let's move on to the revolution of printed books. Communicative technology in the Renaissance continued to develop with a new version of a mass medium, printed books with printed pictures. The printing of books from movable type dates from the same period as Brunelleschi's discovery of perspective. Gutenberg and the movable type printing press. When Brunelleschi was investigating spatial representation techniques, Johannes Gutenberg was experimenting with improved techniques for printing multiple copies of written texts. Gutenberg was a German metalworker who specialized in designing and producing coins. Sometime in the 1430s, he developed a technique for casting multiple letters of type. Paired with his improvements on the printing press and printer's ink, his casting design led to a revolution in printmaking, the beginning of the mass production of books. The oldest surviving specimens of his printing are ecclesiastical or religious in nature, a poem on the Last Judgment, and a church calendar for the year 1448. What is now called the Gutenberg Bible was created around 1454 to 55. And of the 180 copies that were originally printed, only 48 survive. So we could think that 180 copies doesn't seem like a lot in terms of our standards, but if you think about how long it would take a monk to handwrite the entire Bible, and then the very short amount of time it would take or comparatively short amount of time to print those 180 copies, this was truly a revolution in mass media. Gutenberg revolutionized the dispersal of knowledge in the Western world. What a German scholar wrote in 1910 is still true today. He said, quote, "The invention of Gutenberg should be classed with the greatest events in the history of the world. It caused a revolution in the development of culture." Gutenberg's invention helped the development of sciences in modern times by creating a mass medium which allowed for the rapid transfer of knowledge from one place to another. Books could be printed far more quickly than medieval manuscripts could be handwritten. Once books were printed, they could be shipped to other locations so that scholars in different parts of the world were able to read about scientific discoveries and experimentation all over Europe. While nothing rivals the speed of the internet at disseminating or spreading information, books allowed knowledge and information to be shared much more widely and quickly than had been possible before. Thus, not only is Gutenberg's art inseparable from the progress of modern science, but it has also been an indispensable factor in the education of people at large. Culture and knowledge, until then considered aristocratic privileges peculiar to certain classes, were popularized by Gutenberg's typography. The Gutenberg Bible may well have been the first major book published in the West, but the first bestseller, quote unquote, was the printed copy of Martin Luther's Disputation on the Power and Efficacy of Indulgences, and this was commonly known as the 95 Theses. And the new technology of the printing press played a major role in the spread of Luther's ideas and led to the Protestant Reformation. All right, and now we're going to talk about printed images. So we were talking about printed text in the form of books, and now we're looking at printed images, and this is Albrecht Dürer, a woodcut print of a rhinoceros from 1515. Printed pictures, mass medium technology of the perspective age. So the definition of a printed picture that we're going to use for this chapter is a printed picture is one that can be multiplied without any change from the original image. During the 15th and 16th centuries, printed pictures took three forms. So they had woodcuts, etching, and engravings. And again, these techniques allowed for relatively inexpensive pictures to be sold and distributed much more quickly and inexpensively than a hand-drawn picture. By the end of the 15th century, artists began to use woodcuts, etchings, and engravings for perspective images. The impact of these mass-produced perspective images can be compared to the impact of the mass-produced words of the printed Bible. They gradually but inevitably change people's expectations and outlook on all aspects of life. And this is a self-portrait painted by Albrecht Dürer in the year 1500. Albrecht Dürer printed images as fine art. The greatest printmaker of the Renaissance was the German artist Albrecht Dürer. His work illustrates the wide range of influence printed images had on the culture of the Renaissance. Dürer combined the Italian love of the idealized human figure with his own northern love for natural detail. Although his earliest works show the flat space of medieval art, Dürer admired the new technique of perspective so much that he became a master of it, and through his etchings, engravings, and woodcuts, he became its chief advocate throughout Europe. And that was because so many people could see his images because he made multiple copies of them, which could be disseminated. And these are just two examples of his very fine, one is an etching and one is an engraving. So the Agony in the Garden, which is a story of Jesus the night before he was crucified, and then an engraving of Adam and Eve. You can just see how much fine work there are, and especially in the Adam and Eve portrait, look in the background and you can see all kinds of animals. Dürer had a real love for replicating the natural world in his artwork. These are from 1515 and 1504. Fine art versus popular art. The distinction between fine art and popular art that began to take form at this time. Like Dürer, many artists made prints that demonstrated the same skill and sense of personal vision as the more valuable oil paintings. In fact, artists often made prints on the same themes as their famous paintings. So they might make a painting and then they would also do a print of the same subject matter. These were collected by the upper middle class and wealthy buyers. In contrast, printed images of scenes from the lives of saints, like today's posters or picture magazines, presented images of heroes that almost anyone could afford. They were sold at fairs, 1 penny plain, 2 penny colored. So, as the public art sponsored by the church began to decline in importance, the division between fine art and popular art became even more significant. Oil paintings and prints by famous artists were usually displayed in private spaces, like palaces or the homes of the affluent or wealthy. The distinction between fine art and popular art grew until the mass media of the 20th century again enabled fine art and popular art to share the same public space. And so these are examples of drawers, inexpensive woodcut cards. If you only had a penny, you could buy one that didn't have color. If you had a little more money, if you had 2 pennies, you could buy one which had color applied to it. Same image, one with color, one without. All right, and then we'll end with the most important impact of printed images. The main impact of printed images did not stem from art, however. It was the cumulative impact of all the informative, technical, entertaining, and artistic images together that was important. Their wide distribution and their common base in perspective gradually taught all classes of people to expect a new level of factual detail in images, and this expectation applied to all images, whatever their primary purpose. All right, thanks for joining.